Thank you so much, Marcelo, for this very interesting paper. Personally, I would like to know more about digital literacy, or the need for digital literacy for children, adolescents, and the young generations. If you can say something more about that. Now, let's see Celine, and then, okay. Please.
Thank you very much. I have a question concerning pedagogy, because in your paper you don't mention exactly what kind of pedagogical tools or path could be, or in your experience, according to the vast numbers of experience you hear of, are there some of them which are better, which enable better the integration of, for example, of immigrants, youth, in a country, or in and more generally speaking, what are the kind of pedagogy that you would promote in order to foster what you just explained? Thank you.
Yes, Marcelo, really an excellent paper. First, what I really like, and then I'll ask you a question. I really like that you said clearly in the paper that opportunities for children to learn are clearly differentiated or blocked by poverty and malnutrition. And why do I say that I like this? And you define poverty not just in income terms, but in access to clean water, to safe shelter, etc. Because curiously, at least in my country, the health priority for the health minister is the obesity of children, not the malnutrition of children. Of course, some forms of obesity are linked to bad quality of food, but the focus should be hunger, malnutrition, and poverty, elimination of poverty. And I think this is key for the world. I mean, it's really key, so I really like that you stress this point. The question is similar to the one Cecile raised, but mine to the international level. You know, G20 now has, when I was Sherpa for Argentina for G20, I negotiated in G20 the introduction of a working group on education. We didn't have one, the G7 has one, so there is a working group on education. And I also negotiated that the ministers of education meet with the ministers of labor. So they talk about necessary changes in curricula, which is related to pedagogy, to the question. But if you had to suggest something at the international level, these principles, something that could be coordinated, where the G20 could play a role, what would you suggest?
Thank you so much, Marcelo, for your excellent presentation. When you are dreaming about the future of school and the future of education, how do you imagine the physical environment of the classrooms, the school design, the architecture of the classrooms? At the IDB, we have been working about this and found that the old fashion of the classrooms in terms of resembling factories are completely outdated today. Do you agree with this, or you are imagining another sort of construction of building of physical environment about this?
Thank you so much. I start with Professor Donati on the tools that the digital technologies seem to be requiring of in the practice of teaching and in the processes of learning. A state-of-the-art study just completed by John Rogers at the University of California, a nationally representative sample of school principals in the United States, it reveals fascinating data. What the principals wake up in the morning, and worry about the most is completely surprising. Of course, we live in a culture where school shootings and violence and bullying has invaded the classroom. This is part of the general invasion of the culture of incivility and the culture of crassness that now is politically performed. What Rogers found in his research is that principals worry the most about the fact that children and youth cannot synthesize, can rely increasingly in what we would call uncurated, let's call it fake findings. They have no capacities. They're writing papers using digital tools without the fundamental literacies to, A, separate out what is junk from what is based on truth, on beauty, and on what is good. So the massive invasion, and I would love to see similar studies conducted in other high and middle income countries today, of this world of fakeness, is the numero uno concern of principals in the United States. They worry more about that than about almost anything else, because so much flows from this ocean, not the ocean of truth that Newton reminded us, but the ocean of, let's call it garbage that so many children are exposed to. So that's my first reflection. So who does this well? Celine, who does this well? Especially on the issue of refugee and immigrant children. Some years ago, I was asked by the Bertelsmann Foundation. The Bertelsmann Foundation gives the German Nobel Prize to help on what they call the German Nobel Prize, the Bertelsmann Prize. And this was done in a very systematic way. I think we spent a year, 2 years just researching, learning who is doing a good job in terms of easing the transition of refugee and immigrant origin children to the narrative of the nation, to the family of the nation, to citizenship, to belonging, to the transition to the labor market. The award went to the public schools in Toronto, Canada. And this is very funny because coincidentally, this was at the time when the mayor of Toronto was arrested for smoking crack in his official functions. So I always say that it takes a crack smoking mayor to produce the best programs for immigrant and refugee integration. This is only superficially funny. Clearly, Canada has endeavored to reimagine and rethink what we, the schemas that we think of school when it comes to serving immigrant and refugee origin children. The qualities of the best programs that we analyzed during this, project were quite isomorphic. There's a common grammar here. And this is really fundamentally restructuring the school. The school now becomes a center for community services and community engagement, meaning the parents gravitate towards the school for, in the case of Toronto, English language learning, for citizenship, for help in filling out job applications. Schools become all-purpose, whole child, whole family, whole community institutions that defy our thinking of school as it was imagined, really first by Horace Mann and the creation of the normative ideal of a free, non-denominational public school system that originated really in Massachusetts. And of course, Sarmiento brought to Argentina because of his friendship with Horace and Mary Mann. Mary Mann translated Recuerdos de Provincia into English, by the way. So there are many models. There are many models that are of very high quality. Toronto, Sweden, has excellent schools. We did a large initiative in Sweden, in Stockholm, for the best practices for immigrant and refugee origin children. In Paris, I was so happy to visit with Georges Jarpac, Pierre Lénat, the Manalapat schools that are teaching science in ways that are extremely engaging to children. Most children, the phenomenology of experience for most children in schools today is one of boredom and disconnection. We did a basic study, was widely reported in the United States. We asked children to fill out a sentence. School is, fill in the blank. The overwhelming response is boring. And I asked Dr. Sussberg, who was the former Minister of Education in Germany, the first woman head of the Bundestag, and she said, without missing a beat, if you were to ask the children in Germany, they would say, school is boring. So this is a problem. If you're a minority child, if you're a refugee child, if you're an immigrant origin child, it's a binary affect in schools. It's boredom and fear. The children are afraid. Going to school often means going through rituals of violence that are unimaginable in high-income countries. So what is it that we need? If we could have one thing is really opportunities to learn. Millions of children today are locked out of the opportunity structure for the symbolic, for the linguistic, for the emotional work that education does, even before we address the higher order cognitive and metacognitive issues that flow from being in schools. If you had to do one thing and one thing only, I would go back to repeat a mantra, and that is educate the girls. Every cent that is invested in the quality education of the girls and young women is the returns are exquisitely rich. So if you had to do one thing only, it's focus on educating girls and women. In terms of obesity, this is another form of malnutrition. It's too much caloric intake this is part of the junk culture that is so much part of life today. Gustavo, in terms of how to reimagine the school, yes, of course. Horace Mann, when he first invented the idea of what would become free, public, universal, non-denominational schooling, imagined and structured the school very much along a kind of a model of production that is completely irrelevant to the realities of the 21st century. I think there is enormous innovation going on in multiple domains on how schools can and should look now and moving forward. Many opportunities that flow from, obviously, communication, information technologies, digital technologies that can get to children in ways that heretofore were not possible. But there is no silver bullet. There is no silver bullet. The digital promise flows from quality, flows from smart curriculum, flows from hands-on, student-centered learning, which is the tried and true way of moving the needle in terms of getting at the metacognitive skills that are so fundamental to the nature of the futures of work moving forward. These are the skills and the competencies and the sensibilities that flow from what remains today a face-to-face, human-to-human interaction. I walk into schools all over the world, and I have a general rule. A good school is a school where the teachers are rooting for the children. There is a relational engagement. 100 years of cognitive neuroscience show that time on task is the best predictor of the developing of cognitive and metacognitive skills. Time on task. This is what we call behavioral engagement, staying with the work of schooling. What predicts time on task is the relationship, what we call relational engagement. It's the relationship between the child and the teacher. This is the best predictor. If a child has a bond, a human bond, the child will thrive. So the basic test is you walk into a school. Are the teachers rooting for the children? That's a good school. A great school is a school where the children are rooting for the teachers. So I have a question. Will children root for robots if and when this I personally consider a horrific idea, because the nature of the human neocortex, the nature of the ways in which the heart knows, for which reason has no reason, as Pascal reminded us, are so dependent on this human face-to-face relationship. This has a kinesthetic intelligence quality. There is an embodiment of empathy, of what the great English psychoanalyst, Donald Winnicott, calls the mirroring function. The child grows in the context of the gaze the mother, the caretaker, gives of her, of him, in the nature of the relationship between the self and the other. That mirroring relationship, this is why it's so interesting to see the scientists at MIT, at the Media Lab and elsewhere, when they make the robots, the most important feature of the robots is they have to have human-like eyes because of the mirroring that is so imprinted by 4 million years of human evolution. So I believe that the idea of the school, the way I went to schools in Buenos Aires, Gustavo, with the rows and with the teacher giving the lesson, is in fundamental ways past. The foundations remain constant. Without deep reading, without deep empathy, without the capacity to admire. What do we mean by admiration? Is right? The gaze, the mirror function that comes from a human relationship. So the robots can be made cuddly, they can be made furry and huggable, and beautiful eyes that track you. But at the end of the day, it is the human gaze, it is the human mirroring that makes the relationship between the child and the more advanced learner. This is not news. The great Vygotsky, 100 years ago, defined education as this contract, an ethical contract between a more advanced learner and a more novice learner in the scaffolding of reaching what Paolo Freire, we were talking about Freire, it calls new forms of conscientizao, awareness, understanding of the human condition.
Thank you. Any other question? Well, thank you, Marcelo. We stop here.